I've heard the tales about her, the Spelljammer, the mistress of wild space. There are those who say she serves the dark powers herself, that she carries evil gods and Tanari from one world to another. I say that's Codswallop, and I say this because she saved my life, and my crew, whom you could ask if you could find them. In any case, the gig was up from the start. Nautiloids from the Theia home fleet were on top of us before we got past its moon. A dozen of them at the least, as if we had sent out invitations for a rendezvous. They were loaded for bear and ready to take us on. Then she appeared, radiant as an akin. Diving into the pack of Nautiloids, the Spelljammer scattered them like a pack of minnows by a whale.
Wait. What is a Spelljammer again? It's a ship that goes through space with a helm. Nah, it's just that one ship he's talking about, the Spelljammer. Isn't it a verb? As in, we be spelljamming. Alright, time for some Eldritch History. This week's all about Spelljammer. With the 5th edition book coming out in just a few days, it seemed like no better time to talk about it than right now. One of the many campaign settings for Dungeons & Dragons, Spelljammer can most easily be summed up as D&D in space. But it also established ties between multiple other campaign settings, namely Greyhawk, Dragonlance, and the Forgotten Realms. But we'll get into all that in just a bit. As usual, let's start at the beginning. A knight standing on the deck of a ship in space. He doesn't freeze. He doesn't blow up. He doesn't float away. Everything that follows comes out of that one image. That's from Jeff Grubb, the lead designer and basically creator of Spelljammer. And this was the image that he presented at Augie's, a local Lake Geneva bar, in 1988. The R&D managers of TSR had brought in the designers there for an afternoon-long brainstorming session to plan the next box sets. Grubb came to the meeting with an agenda. He wanted to push the boundaries of standard fantasy, and he had the idea that began with that single image, the knight standing on the deck of a ship in space, unprotected from the elements. In other words, Grubb proposed D&D in space. Now, originally he got a little bit of pushback, like, how would he survive? That's not how space works, and blah, 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 blah. He was like, we have a game where you fight dragons. Why are you worried about this? Luckily, Grubb won out, and in 1989, we get the first of the 2nd edition AD&D settings with Spelljammer, Adventures in Space. But the detractors did bring up a point that probably needed to be addressed, and that other people might question, wait, how does this all work? Which led to the creation of what is known as Grubbian physics. Essentially, Jeff Grubb approached all of it as if, well, we have worlds where magic is the main driver of what we would know as physics instead of science, so why not do the same in space? So it's this extrapolation of a magical reality onto a non-scientific space travel. So in this Grubbian physics world, we have space divided into wild space and the phlogiston. And these two elements are separated by crystal spheres. Don't worry, I'm going to break down all of those. So wild space is what we think of as space. It's the vacuum outside of planets and whatnot. The celestial bodies, which are any significantly large conglomeration of matter that is wheeling about in wild space. These range from asteroids to suns, but generally refers to planetary mass. And these can be any shape in Grubbian physics. They are mostly spherical, but some are flat, others elliptical, cubic, amorphous, ring-shaped, hollow. They could even potentially be shaped like a Mobius strip. So you got these celestial bodies surrounded by this wild space. And then they hit the crystal sphere, which is what it sounds like, a giant sphere. Sometimes they're also known as crystal shells. But they are made of unbreakable, dark ceramic-like material. And legends say that these were actually created and placed by the gods to protect their worlds from the phlogiston outside. We'll get to that in just a bit. But other people say that instead the crystal spheres were placed by even higher powers than the gods in order to confine the gods. And within this crystal sphere, in this wild space, you get multiple different types of solar system organization. The one we're most familiar with be the stellar centric, where the star or sun is in the middle, like ours. Others are geocentric, like old thoughts of how Earth worked, where it was at the center. Greyhawk is actually an example of this. It's a geocentric solar system. Some solar systems don't move at all. They're just stationary. Others don't have a sun. And some just have everything moving about erratically. Now, this idea of the crystal spheres with the solar system and all the planets inside it was partly inspired by the cover art for Daniel Borston's The Discoverers. It shows a person crawling out of a sphere with stars on it into this further universe beyond. But these crystal or crystalline spheres harken back to older geocentric models of our universe, our solar system, put forward by thinkers such as Plato, Aristotle, and Ptolemy. In Plato's and then refined by Aristotle's view, the Earth was at the center, hence geocentric, and it was surrounded by 47 to 55 concentric spheres composed of an incorruptible substance called aether. And within these are where the planets and the stars were held, and their movement is what caused the stars and planets to move about in the sky, including the sun, of course. If the Earth is at the center, the sun revolves around us. Ptolemy then had hypotheses which were assumed correct for over a millennium by European and Islamic astronomers. And in his system, each planet moved by a system of two different spheres. The planet moves around a smaller sphere called the epicycle, which in turn moves around a larger sphere called the different. And despite being called geocentric, these spheres were all centered around eccentric points away from the Earth, determined by the different planet. And the necessity of this two-sphere system instead of each one just being on one, and the off-center eccentric instead of being a true geocentric model, was to explain the apparent retrograde motion and the speed changes observed in planetary motion, results of the Earth not being the center and planets orbiting the sun in an elliptical fashion instead of circular. But to be fair, in order for it to not be geocentric, the stars have to be so far out there in order to not shift very obviously that for a long time this was the easier idea instead of having a universe that was just so vast. But that's what we got. So back to Spelljammer. Outside these crystal spheres, you got what is known as the phlogiston, this turbulent rainbow ocean of flammable ether, a multicolored sea where the crystal spheres bob and float, and Spelljammers sail upon flows like rivers. The heavier, the denser the flow, and the more surface area exposed to it, the faster the flight of the Spelljammer, which is why a lot of them have sails. And travel outside these rivers of moving phlogiston is possible, but incredibly slow. Also, as I said, phlogiston is flammable, so any fire at all causes an explosion. So people in Spelljammers just do not use fire at all. There's some spells that allow you to repress this, but it still causes an explosion. Their example is that if you cast a fireball, it just blows up centered on the caster and does 3 times as much damage and 3 times as much of an area is affected due to this incredibly flammable phlogiston. But interestingly, the phlogiston can't exist within the crystal spheres. If you try to grab some and bring it in, it just vanishes as soon as it passes that threshold. And much like the crystal spheres, the phlogiston is based off of prior conceptions of how the universe worked. In this case, it was a theoretical element to explain how combustion worked. Most people would probably be familiar with the classical theory of the 4 elements: water, earth, fire, and air. But Johann Joachim Becher, in 1667, the book Physica Subterranea proposed a different idea, in which fire and air were replaced by 3 different versions of Earth, including, most importantly for our purposes, terra pinguis, fat Earth, basically, in which gave substances their oily, sulfurous, and combustible properties. This was later expanded upon by George Ernst Stahl, who changed terra pinguis into phlogiston, from the Greek for burned. And in his theories, metals were made of calx, which we would now call oxides, and phlogiston. And heating a metal removed the phlogiston and left the calx behind. And this phlogiston theory was prevalent for about a century, but it altered along that time. Some people claimed that it was its own substance. Others said it was more of a principle or property of other substances. Some said it was even the basis of color and fermentation. When hydrogen was first discovered, before it was called hydrogen, it was called inflammable air at that point. Some thought this was phlogiston. But then came Antoine Laurent de Lavoisier. I'm sure I butchered that name. I'm sorry. French is not my thing. Who between 1770 and 1790 came up with the oxygen theory of combustion through a series of tests in which he contained all the different elements of a reaction, making sure not to lose anything. He recognized that the involvement of air was crucial for combustion. His experiments also resulted in him naming this inflammable air hydrogen. He also named oxygen once he figured out that was a big thing. He also helped give evidence of the law of conservation of mass, and of course his oxygen theory of combustion were his main contributions to science. So after him, there were some holdouts, people who tried to unite his theories and the theories of phlogiston, but after him it was pretty much the death knell of the idea of phlogiston. It wasn't this mysterious extra element or property. It was oxygen. That's what was helping things burn. All right, so we got our setup. We got planets, prime material planes, surrounded by their wild space, trapped inside these crystal spheres, which are in turn surrounded by this phlogiston. What do we do with that? Well, we get spaceships like the Spelljammers. But there's a few more concepts that are core to figuring out how do spaceships work. Because with all that, we still have this, basically it just looks like a pirate ship. It's like the iconic Spelljammer. So how are you standing on deck? How are you not floating off into space? How are you breathing? There's a couple extra Grubbian physics at play that explain this. The first is the air envelope. So this is basically a concept where whenever anything, even a person, passes through the edge of a celestial bodies, a planet's breathable air, an envelope of air clings to them. And in general, this envelope is about 3 times the size of the thing. So if you somehow are launched out into space, you're going to have air for a little bit of time, but it's not that much. So you're going to run out pretty soon. But on much larger things, such as ships, they're going to have air envelopes that can last them for months. So they're able to make these journeys to other crystal spheres with this air that just naturally, because of the magical nature, just clings to them. Okay, so you can breathe, but what's keeping you on the ship? Well, that's the concept of a gravity plane. Basically, in Spelljammer, everything in space has its own gravity. The larger it is, the more powerful, of course. And the direction of which is described as that which is most convenient. So a planet is going to direct you towards the center, like we know. But smaller bodies, like ships, have this gravity plane. So this is actually basically a 2-dimensional plane that crosses through roughly the middle. And anything above that is going to be directed towards the bottom, and anything below that is going to be directed towards the top, which results in you being able to stand on the deck of a ship with no problem. But you can also stand on the bottom of a ship with no problem. And then anything dropped off the ship will actually just bob as the direction of the gravity changes. So once you pass the halfway mark or wherever the gravity plane is, the gravity shifts. So you'll drop for a little bit, then you'll bob back up and then drop and bob back and forth. There is even a side panel in one of the books saying, well, if this is the case, why don't we have decks on both sides of ships? Which some people did, but the issue comes when the ship comes in contact with something bigger than it, then the gravity plane of that is going to take precedence. So if you dock at a planet or bump into a ship, well, suddenly anything that's on the bottom based on the larger body's gravitational plane is going to be falling off because it doesn't obey your gravity plane anymore. So it's more practical just to have an up and a down. So now that we can ignore all those science facts and just relax, how do you go about spelljamming? How do you go from sphere to sphere or within wild space? The answer to that is most often answered by the spelljamming helm. These are throne-like seats where magical energy is converted into movement for a ship. There's a couple different types of helm, mainly a major helm or a minor helm, as it sounds like a major helm is better able to convert magical energy and it'll be faster than a minor helm, where it takes more juice to go not as fast, not as far. And when I say that it takes magical energy, somebody who can cast spells is sat in this throne-like seat and it sucks out their magic. Basically, it burns through your spell slots, so you're able to propel the ship and travel through space. As I said, those helms are the most likely to be used. There's even spells that allow you to just make helms temporarily, and you can just put them on, like you got a longboat, whatever, minor helm, now you're spelljamming longboat, doesn't matter. But there's a couple different ways to go about this too. Some are also called helms, some are different from that. A very rare one, very sought after one, is a magic item known as the Crown of the Stars. And this functions like a helm, but it's portable. And it can be used like one of those minor or lesser helms for any ship that doesn't have one. They also function up to a mile away, so you can remotely control your ship. And although it's called a crown of the stars, it doesn't have to be a crown. Basically, it could be anything that you wear, except they specifically call out that it can't be a ring. It's bigger than a ring. And the ones that are known to exist usually involve some sort of silver metal in their construction. There's also helms made by different races or groups of people. The Mind Flayers have a couple, one of which is the Ceres helm. So it's basically like those lesser helms, but there's multiple of them all connected together. And usually on Spelljammers, you can only have one helm at a time. You can't just hook up a bunch together and get faster or go further or anything, except the Mind Flayers can. And partly because their psionics isn't quite the magical energy needed for a normal helm, so they found a different way to do it where they can pool themselves together. And the more they have, the more Mind Flayers or whoever they have powering these hooked up together, the better they're going to be able to move through space. They also made a pool helm. This is powered by the Mind Flayer life pool, and it primarily is used to move about Mind Flayer Great Old Ones. Now, I couldn't find anything about if this is supposed to be like Cthulhu-esque monsters. It sounds just like Elder Brains. I don't know if they got their wires crossed on here or something, or they were still coming up with the core concept. The Spelljammer book specifically says it moves the Mind Flayer Great Old Ones, but if you play Warlock in 5e, you have a very different idea of what a Great Old One is than something to do with the Mind Flayer life pool. So I'm assuming this is just those Elder Brains, those giant hive mind ruling brains that control Mind Flayer colonies. But basically, this is the pool that it sits in to sustain itself, and it's able to move like a Spelljammer. Beholders also have made their own alternate versions of a helm. Theirs are actually living beholderkin, known as the Orbus. And these things are bred just to fly their ships. They're blind, they're basically helpless, with almost no will of their own. All they do is pilot these ships. And it even calls out that it's even possible for humans or other humanoids to control one. But beholders would rather disintegrate the Orbis than to let it fall into the hands of somebody else. And both the Mind Flayer and Beholder helm options point to the fact that both were pretty prevalent in Spelljammer. They're pretty big movers and shakers in the space between the crystal spheres. The Mind Flayers even kind of get less like just overtly evil. They almost take more of a trader or merchant role, which is one reason why Spelljammer brought in a different race known as the Neogi. These ruthless, xenophobic slavers and plunderers who are hated by everybody in Spelljammer. They kind of are this spider-like eel thing. They remind me of the critters from Starship Troopers, but they're sentient and they speak and stuff like that. But continuing on with the Spelljammer helm alternatives, there's also these things known as forges, which are made by the dwarves to power their citadels. And the citadels are essentially just fortresses built into asteroids that are just hurtling through space under the power of these forges, which converts the creative energy of the dwarves who are using the literal forges. They are actually forges, and that creative energy moves the mountains. And they actually mine out the resources from the asteroid itself, which eventually results in a finished ship because they've mined out all the resources they can get from it. And so they abandon it and go get a new asteroid to use. And then those abandoned old citadels are sometimes used as lairs by monsters. There's also gnomish helms, which have plenty of bells and whistles, but very little substance. They're large, gaudy, ornate, and overblown. The ones that work, only about 60%, only do so because there's a minor helm hidden within somewhere. It's basically lemons in the spelljamming communities. They're sold off to people who don't know what they're doing. Imagine this used car lot type gnome trying to offload this ship that just doesn't work. Another type is known as furnaces. These are early versions of helms powered by feeding magical items into the furnace itself. It destroys the item unless it's immune to fire, and that powers the ship. They're now usually found on ghost or crash ships because they've moved on to the better spelljamming helms and making new ones. And these ones are also limited to only move about in wild space because the flames of the furnace cause devastation in the phlogiston. Again, being incredibly flammable. If that came out with the burning fires of the furnace, they are screwed. There's also a different version of that called artifurnaces, which, as you might guess by the portmanteau, they're furnaces tuned specifically to an artifact, a particular artifact at that. So they're even more rare than artifacts themselves, and they're highly sought after, and they cause insurrection in their wake. And almost all the ones known to exist, which is less than 10, they've been destroyed or hidden over the years. They also, if you remove the artifact from them, where it draws its power from, they are destroyed, these artifurnaces. Another option is known as a life jammer, which is powered by draining the life of a person placed within. They are believed to be developed by the Nyogi, and the more powerful you are, the more likely you can actually survive this. It doesn't instantly kill you or anything. It just drains a certain amount of hit points over time. So while good aligned people generally don't do this in fear of, killing a person, there's options for, I'll do it today and just take a little hit, and maybe somebody else does it tomorrow, so we don't actually have to kill somebody in case of this emergency of only having a life jammer and we need to get out of here. And then there's non-magical engines. These include ones of gnomish design. Some use just chemical propellants. Others are explosive mixtures ignited in a closed space. But they're all incredibly slow and used only as an emergency backup or on auxiliary vehicles such as lifeboats or shuttles. Or they're sometimes used to move through magic dead areas where the Spelljammer doesn't work. And there's one other, I wouldn't even call it a type, it is a specific ship that moves about in its own way. And that is the Spelljammer, capital S. It's a legendary ship akin to our Flying Dutchman. It's known as the Queen of Wildspace, the Holy Grail of the Phlogiston. It's massive. The biggest Spelljammer ship there is. It's 1/3 of a mile by 2/3 of a mile large. Looks like a mix between some kind of ray, a manta ray or stingray, and a scorpion. And it's sentient, and it moves itself through space. And it uses constructs of its own making as its crew. And there's this complex society, or city basically, on its back, where Gif, beholders, halflings, goblins, mind flayers, centaurs, all kinds of creatures live in various sections. And there's a whole 60-page booklet in one of the box sets just taking a tour about what's in this, because there's just so much going on this sentient ship. And when you're in it, when you're on it, it tries to dominate anybody within its air envelope. And there's, going along with the legendary aspect of it, there's multiple stories of it being destroyed, but it's still out there. They didn't take. But there's another story where actually it does get destroyed, but the Spelljammer makes what are known as small jammers that grow up to replace it. The oldest one will grow to become the next Spelljammer in case it's ever destroyed. With normal Spelljammers, there's a bunch of different designs. Anything you can imagine, really, could be a Spelljammer ship. From the baseline of just looking like a wooden sailing ship out on the sea, to a lot of them look like living creatures, particularly creatures of the sea, like dolphins or whales or sea urchins or pufferfish. The mind flayers are particularly fond of sea creatures, usually something with a shell, like they're nautiloids, or something that looks like a squid or an octopus. I already mentioned the dwarves are fond of just carving up asteroids to move around. Gnomes have these just cobbled together looking things. They look like they're just going to fall apart at any point. Elves are fond of winged creatures like butterflies or hummingbirds. The Gif, they're like British army officer hippos, essentially. And they fight with blunderbusses and like flintlock rifles. They have a ship known as the Bombard, which is essentially just a giant gun or cannon mounted to the front. It shoots off, which is extra interesting because fire doesn't work in the phlogiston, so they only really can be used in wild space. So it's a bold choice, but I mean, guns are the Gif's thing, so it makes sense. So going off of the Gif having this giant gun at the front of their ship, there are a few different options for armaments for Spelljammers. The most basics being catapults or ballista, which are essentially what you think of. Catapults just throw stones. The ballistas are just giant crossbows. There's also a specific one known as the gnomish sweepers, which are 2 connected ballistae. And there's a chain linking their bolts together. And it's a prototype anti-personnel weapon, because as these bolts are shot, this chain will just sweep people off of the hull of another ship. Spelljammers can also have rams in the front, which can punch holes in ships. Some designed specifically for piercing. Other ones are blunt to make sure you don't stick with each other. Or some are made for grappling to make sure you do stick on the other ship you ram. There's also bombards as the gift ship, which are very rare, expensive, and dangerous to use. They're just cannons, essentially. And part of this is the phlogiston, again, will cause it to explode if it's there, so dangerous. But also, different crystal spheres have different rules for gunpowder, or smoke powder, as it's called. So it doesn't work everywhere, and it's very rare. And it is also dangerous in the phlogiston. If a ship is hit, if you have some, you have to roll to make sure it doesn't explode on you. So for that reason, bombards aren't very popular. There's also this type of armament called the jettison, which is it just scatters debris everywhere. This could be stones, trash, iron spikes, garbage. And it calls out that catapults can be used as jettisons in a pinch, but not the other way around. So catapults are far more popular. And finally, the last armament is the Greek fire projector, which shoots liquid flame for the same reason as bombards. Dangerous, not very popular. Only work in wild space, and only if you are close enough to connect your air envelope with the other people, because otherwise it doesn't work out in space, because it's a vacuum. One side effect of these different crystal spheres, very particularly because the different worlds had different rules for how the stars worked or their cosmologies and their pantheons of gods and stuff. They were very specifically separated by this crystal sphere. And this also extended to the powers of the gods. Like I said, they were contained in that. So when it came to clerics in Spelljammer, there were some very specific restrictions, extra rules, in which the power of the gods ends at the crystal spheres. So if you're outside the crystal sphere where your god resides, you can't regain spells above 2nd level, unless you're somewhere else that has worshippers of that god. This restriction also brought about various space faiths, which would circumvent this restriction in various ways. There's the polygots, who just worship an entire pantheon of gods. So if any member is present, then they have their powers. So the example they give is if you worship the Norse pantheon, then your spells still work in the Forgotten Realms because Tyr is a god there. There's also followers of the Path and the Way, who instead believe in this celestial bureaucracy where various powers are responsible for specific duties. And different sects disagree on which deities hold which slots, but if you're anywhere that has followers of the Path and the Way, you still gain your powers. There's also those who worship Ptah, which is the traveler's god and a creator deity from the Egyptian pantheon. And he has a weird distinction of dwelling in the ethereal plane, and he's known in practically every major sphere, but his faith lies in space, and then any crystal sphere where the Egyptian mythos is recognized. And then there's various planar churches who respect and venerate all the powers of a specific plane of existence. These could be the inner planes or the outer planes. So, for example, if you worship everybody from Mount Celestia, you're worshiping Amaterasu, a Japanese sun goddess who is also worshipped in Karatur. You've got Arvarine, the closest thing the halflings have to a war god. There's also Bahamut, the god of the metallic dragons, Jazirian, a Coatl and Naga deity, Moradin, the chief dwarven god, and Tyr, who I mentioned before from Norse mythology, and more. There's more than that. And if any of these gods are worshipped where you're at, then you still gain your clerical powers and those higher level spells. So now that we've gone over some of what Spelljammer is all about, I want to go through what they've put out for Spelljammer over the years. Starting with that first box set, Spelljammer Adventures in Space, 1989. In this box set, it's established that there's 3 main spheres in the setting. These are the 3 main settings of D&D at that time. You got Realm Space for the Forgotten Realms, Grey Space for Greyhawk, and Kryn Space for Dragonlance. They also detail another city that is never really firmly established where it is. If you're around any of those, you could put it there, or you could just put it wherever. But this is the Rock of Brawl, this mile-long, half-mile-deep asteroid city. And it's passed through many hands through the years. There's ruins and caverns that indicate that it was once a mind flayer outpost, and it served as a battleground for warring beholder groups. There was a dwarven colony that was eradicated mysteriously, and even the Elven Armada used it as a recreation station. But 150 years ago, it was claimed by the bandit king Kozar, who founded the Royal House of Brawl. And then it evolved from a pirate's hiding hole to a major city. It attracted merchants, adventurers, it allied with privateers and raiders for the Elven Alliance. And officially, piracy is banned in the city, and any caught pirates are subject to the full extent of the law. But there's a reason they say caught pirates. There's a lot of winking and looking the other way. And piracy charges are only usually used for turning up the heat on people in trouble for doing other things, especially if you do something against the Royal House of Brawl. You're likely to get the full extent of the law and more likely to wind up being dropped off with the mind flayers. The original Spelljammer box set also describes a few methods of getting into space. There's a bunch of hooks for finding a ship, finding a helm, finding scrolls to create a helm. You can encounter alien abductors or a strange traitor. There's 3 different crash ship scenarios, and there's even one for just finding a dimensional door in a dungeon or somewhere, and then, you're in space now. Guess you gotta find out how to get back. But my favorite by far is the sage. So in this scenario, you're hired by a sage to investigate traveling to space. And he has a few suggestions for how to do this. Take a chariot drawn by swans out in space. Another is to put a saddle on the back of a charmed dragon, just going up in a huge balloon. There's one for getting a brass sphere containing the morning dew. And since dew rises towards the sun, the sphere will be taken with the dew towards the sun. It's also just using wings of flying further than anybody has ever heard of. Another is building a machine based off old gnomish drawings that mimics the birds themselves. How about this one? There's a huge tower, and you fill it with smoke powder and ignite it. And the heroes are all at the top of the tower within a cube of force. And so the blast just shoots the heroes into space. And then finally, a dimensional ladder that continually extends itself as you climb up it. So the bottom rungs vanish as the other rungs appear above you, so you can keep climbing. What I love about all this is that all these technically can work to get you into space in Spelljammer. It's just an issue of a lot of them you're not going to have much of an error envelope, so you're not going to be able to go anywhere. And they suggest you let the players try one or multiple and fail and maybe spot an actual Spelljammer. So you're like, oh, this is possible. We're just doing it wrong. The next box set was called The Legend of Spelljammer, and it's all about the Spelljammer, that legendary ship. It even opens with actual legends from people who encountered it, such as the one I used for the intro. It also goes into a lot more detail on the Spelljammer. This is where that booklet of 60 pages of just detailing everything that's on it is located. The next box set was the War Captain's Companion. And this actually contained a board game for ship-to-ship combat, as well as rules for making and upgrading your own ships. This was also a classic example of TSR cramming way too much stuff into their box sets at the time, because there was something like 300 different punch-out cardboard tokens that came with this board game, and like 200 pages or so of rule booklets as well. It's like, there's a lot of stuff in there, and they're probably not charging enough for it. The final box set was called the Astromundi Cluster. So this details cluster space, which instead of a solar system or the like, it's just thousands of asteroids, which humans, illithids, mind flayers, Neogis, and the Arcane coexist. And the Arcane are this mysterious race that have some connection to Spelljammers and helms, because they're one of the very few places you can actually buy helms from. But more interesting than that is the fact that the Astromundi cluster, this cluster space, is in the box set. It claims that this is the origin place of the Mind Flayers. It goes on to say that they're actually just mutated humans who evolved into the Illithid over time. Point of note, a few years later with their big Mind Flayer-centric release, the Illithiid, it goes out of its way to say that this is wrong and somebody just made it up whole cloth. There's no way Mind Flayers were humans at any point, and that this is not where they came from originally. Which is interesting backpedaling on their part. In addition to these box sets, Spelljammer also had a series of resources that came out for it. These were kind of all over the map. One was just a Dungeon Master's screen. Another one was known as Lost Ships, and it just had all kinds of stuff thrown into it. It had rules, more ships, spells, equipment, and adventures. Most notably, it detailed ships for goblins, kobolds, orcs, and ogres, who were previously described as being largely driven out of space in the Unhuman Wars, which more on that later. There's also 3 of these resources that detail the big 3 crystal spheres: Realm Space, Gray Space, and Kryn Space. And they include new ships, new monsters, new magic items, and adventure stuff taking place in these various crystal spheres, including detailing the other planets and objects out in wildspace in these sections. For Realm Space, the crystal sphere for the Forgotten Realms, it includes the Tears of Saloon, which is the moon in that setting. And the Tears are this asteroid cluster that trails the moon. And it also details the world Hekatha, a beholder planet. Gray space and Kryn space basically follow the same guidelines. There's another one called Practical Planetology, which details 15 new planets, and its description partially reads, weigh anchor at the air world Alabeth and float with marooned elves. Visit the mithril dragons of Radol, who ride the hot thermals over lakes of molten tin. Endure the searing flames of the Euphrates city of Ignia, or swim among the island necroraces, nations of undead from a destroyed planet on Charon. And I bring up the point that these planets are only used here and then in some of the novels, because it's a point that's brought up a lot by game historian Shannon Appelkline, who's got a lovely series of books called Designers and Dragons, all about RPG companies and history and stuff. But he brings up the fact that so often in Spelljammer, they'll establish something new and then never revisit it again. Instead of digging deep into a plot or a cluster, they'll throw it out there and then never use it for anything. Like all these planets are just kind of left adrift, never to be seen again. It's like you can use it, but we're not going to do anything with it. Example of them not doing that, though, is one of these resources was all dedicated to the Rock of Brawl, which had shown up in that original box set. It's completely fleshed out here, and it shows up in multiple other things. So it's one of the very few places in Spelljammer that is revisited over and over again. Probably a reason why it seems to be a big point in the new set coming out later this year. Another part of this resource line was Space Layers, which was just 14 mini adventures that you could drop in whenever. Spelljammer also came out during the time of the Monstrous Compendium, so instead of having a monster manual or the like, it's just this collection of sheets that are designed to go into a 3-ring binder. So it got 2. The first Monstrous Compendium, including details for the giant space hamster, which the origin of that is that Jeff Grubb saw the design of a gnome ship that appeared to have a paddle wheel on it, and he asked, what is that for? And the response given to him was that that's not a paddle wheel, that's a giant hamster wheel. So of course they had to go and make giant hamsters for that to be a thing. This compendium also includes details on the Hadozi, also the Grommen, which are both sentient ape creatures, includes details for the plasmoid, and then a bunch of various space versions of other creatures like dolphins, giants, golems, and then also just killer versions of things in space. So killer asteroids, killer moons, space mimics. The second Monstrous Compendium had the Autognome, the Dowar, which are these traitor penguin in like rainbow colors. Included various dragons, the sun, moon, and stellar dragon. There was this thing called a gadabout, which was a plant that had wings on it, and elves would strap it to them, and their root system would like hold on to you, so you could use their wings to move short distances in space. It also had details for the Great Swan, which is just a giant swan you could ride, so kind of giving credence to that sage from the original box set telling you to just use chariot drawn by giant swans to get to space. There's also info for the Skrow, which are just space orcs. Skrow backwards is orcs. As well as the Witchlight Marauders, who were used by the Skrow during the Unhuman Wars. Huge creatures that would just eat and devour everything in their path. It just gorge themselves, and that would cause them to replicate into smaller versions, which would then do the same and replicate in the smaller versions. And then they just eat everything on a planet. And once that was all done, they would grow into a space Witchlight Marauder, which was massive, and it would fly to the next planet to continue the process. There was also, if you like the Muppets, there's Space Swine. So, pigs in space. Thankfully, those are coming back for 5th edition. One other book for Spelljammer that kind of doesn't fit with any other books for this product line, at least, is the Complete Spacefarer's Handbook. And these complete handbooks were originally designed for giving options to players with character kits, where you could get various abilities to fill out certain archetypes of characters. They also included rules for the setting, GM advice, things like how to provision and dock ships, how to build strongholds, and options for space warfare. And this complete Spacefarer's Handbook was also one of the largest player race expansions at the time. It included details for playing as Drakons, which are dragon centaurs who have brontosaurus bodies instead of horse bodies, which are kind of amazing. You can finally play as the Gif, those hippo people. You can play as both the Grommen and the Hadozi, two different types of sentient Planet of the Apes style creatures. The Hadozi are noticeable for being kind of like an ape flying squirrel hybrid. They had these like wing flappings they could soar on. There's a couple lizard options, including Lizard Man and the Herwyet. Bug options, the Rastipede, which is like a centipede, or the Zixchil, praying mantis type creature. And then you could also play as the Skrull, so the space orcs. This book was also released a few years after Spelljammer came out, so a few more settings had been released for D&D at this point. It kind of tied them in, but not really, not satisfactorily at least. It said that Athos, the world of Dark Sun, was so remote that basically you couldn't get to it unless the DM wanted you to. It wasn't connected to any of those phlogiston rivers, so no easy way to get there anyway. And it said that since Ravenloft's Domains of Dreads were in a demiplane, they weren't accessible in a crystal sphere either. Although it did give the caveat that the mists of Ravenloft could get you anywhere, so it's at least a tie-in there. I'll be interested to see if any of the stuff from the new book for 5e will include more rules for get to the other settings. That'd be fun. And then finally, for specifically the role-playing game releases for Spelljammer, we have adventures. The first one was called Wildspace, which was an introductory adventure to get characters off planet. And it happens when a Spelljammer drops an anchor out of the sky at the market where they're at. So you can climb up it and go encounter the Hive, which was described as essentially a beholder-created Death Star. And this thing is massive, the largest in surface area dungeon made by TSR. Each room of this asteroid dungeon is a mile-wide cube. Just utterly bonkers, the scale of this thing. It sounds like it'd be a fun way to get into Spelljammer. The second adventure release is called Skull and Crossbows, and include 19 different adventures in this anthology that's theoretically about hunting pirates, but it's kind of all over the place. It also highlights relics and hulks and the various races of wild space, and there's repeated trips to the Rock of Brawl in here. Once again, one of the few places you go back and forth to in Spelljammer. The third adventure was called The Crystal Spheres. And this is an actual epic adventure spanning 4 new crystal spheres, which once again, you never see them again. But they are Hero Space, which is a heroic adventures only location where 9 planets are divided by alignment specifically. Very meta, but could be cool. Another one is Fairy Space, which is just one gigantic community of fae creatures. There's Great Space, this elder sphere that's focused on nobility and honor. And finally, Dark Space, which is sunless, and this shadowy void is on the inside of that one. Next adventure is called Under the Dark Fist, which I actually detailed in my Gorgon episode. But in it, Emperor Volcaran, who is a Madar, this male offshoot of the Medusa, but he's in control of the Vodani Empire, which spans over 12 different crystal spheres. And he's up against the Free Space Alliance of Kryn Space, Realm Space, and Gray Space. And I went into more detail in the Gorgon episode, but it sounds really fun. There's some cool setup for the Emperor that seems like it'd be a real fun adventure to run. The next one was known as Goblin's Return, and this actually starts setting up the Second Unhuman War. So in the first one, it saw elves defeat the goblinoids. They basically ran them out of wild space, but over the centuries since then, they've been planning their revenge. The Skrull, specifically those space orcs, have rallied the goblins, the hobgoblins, and kobolds to get their revenge. The setup for this adventure is that an orcish fleet has destroyed an elven world, and the PCs need to infiltrate an orc base in order to find out what is going on here. And it got a sequel in Heart of the Enemy, where the heroes are tasked with finding the key to the Skrull army's plans, which was this controlling of those witchlight marauders, those unstoppable force. So you had to stop them from getting the key to controlling and bringing those back. And during the original run of Spelljammer, it actually became a multimedia property. They were very fond of doing that, a TSR at the time. So there was comics put out by DC Comics. It only lasted for 15 issues, but the Spelljammer comics actually spun off from the Forgotten Realms comics being made at the time. The main party from the Forgotten Realms comics meet up with the Spelljammer crew who had been tricked into fighting them. They eventually figured out and defeat the evil lich, I think it was, that they had to fight there. And then one of the main characters from the Forgotten Realms comics, Jasmine, this winged human, she had been part of this love triangle, and then the guy chose the other girl, so she ran off with the Spelljammer crew and became a main character in that comic series instead. There was also a series of novels, 6 novels in fact, known as the Cloakmaster Cycle, which detailed Teldon Moore, this groundling farmer, and groundlings in Spelljammer are just people who live on planets, who's actually from Krynn, so Dragonlance, whose farmhouse is crushed by this crashing Spelljammer, and the dying captain of which makes him take her cloak and keep it away from the Neogi who are chasing her. And so his adventures take him all over the place. He goes to Realm Space, the Rock of Brawl, he encounters the Spelljammer. Sounds like a kind of wild ride. There was even a single video game for Spelljammer, a game for MS-DOS called Spelljammer Pirates of Realm Space. There were 3 main aspects of this game. One is when you were docked at a planet, you could buy or sell cargo and equipment, you could repair or upgrade your ship, and then seek missions. 2 was actually traveling in space and ship-to-ship combat. It was real-time in this simple 3D, and you'd be able to steer and aim and fire your ballistae and your catapults, and you could avoid enemy missiles, and occasionally you'd have to deal with meteor storms that were trying to crash into your ship. The third aspect was onboard personal combat. So if you got close enough to the enemy ships, you could board them, and then you'd control all the officers of your ship in this turn-based combat system, while the computer controls your regular crew and the enemies. There's a whole range of weapons and spells, as well as humans and monsters that you could encounter that way. But you could actually play this game in your browser if you're into that kind of thing. From my experience with it, it seems cool, but I've read reviews that it's often quite buggy and things don't work the way that they're supposed to. I can also tell you from a more modern and very casual video gamer standpoint, it was frustrating. We'll go with frustrating. It was cool though, like going through ship and being able to navigate and fire and stuff. It was cool, but like trying to navigate how to utilize the system was like, there had to have been an easier way of doing this. So Spelljammer started off in 1989 with the adventures in Wildspace, and it ended with that 4th box set about the Astromundi cluster in 1993, at which point the line was canceled, and then the following year they supplanted it as the meta setting that linked all the other ones with Planescape instead. And for the most part, they haven't really touched Spelljammer since then, but there is one thing of note between then and the upcoming one, which is in the 3rd edition era, in Dungeon Magazine number 92 / Polyhedron Magazine number 151, they were doing a reverse. One side was one magazine, the other side was a different one. They released Spelljammer Shadow of the Spider Moon. This was kind of a reimagining of Spelljammer for 3rd edition, the D20 rules. And a very parsed down, they didn't really use any of the Spelljammer creatures specifically because they hadn't shown up again, so they used beholders and mind flayers to bigger effect. But they had a really cool sphere. They didn't give it a blank space name or anything. They just said this solar system, essentially. But it's a pretty cool example of a sphere. I would not mind them bringing back this or something like it. Instead of being a sun specifically, there's this thing known as Pyre, which is hypothesized by some to be this portal to the plane of fire, or that it once was just a normal world, but it was cursed by infernal magic, so it just covered in flames. And there's other worlds, one of which is a desert world of this white dust because it's so close to that giant fireball. There's a jungle planet of serpents, lizards, and dinosaurs, a holy water world, a planetary forest ruled by elves, the moon of which, the spider moon from the title, is where the dark elves, the drow, were banished off to. And then there's a far-off, almost frozen world known as Moradin's Forge, that dwarven god Moradin. It's this cold planet, but underneath, in tunnels, they're all geothermically heated so you can survive, which is how the dwarves live there. but it's now being overtaken by mind flayers. There's some really cool things that they were coming out with. This pretty big expansion and book. It's got rules for how Spelljammer works and various items and magic that you'd need to run a Spelljammer campaign in 3rd edition. It's pretty cool. Okay, so finally we can talk about them bringing back Spelljammer after nearly, 30 years, really, barring some magazine issues. They've been teasing for years, Spelljammer confirmed in various official Wizards of the Coast releases, but finally actually not quite confirmed it, but really hinted at it with the Unearthed Arcana, this playtest options for Travelers of the Multiverse, where you could get beta test rules for playing as an Astral Elf, an Autognome, a Gif, a Hadozi, a Plasmoid, or a 3-Creen, which was really cool. Bringing back all these things from Spelljammer, except for 3-Creen is more famously known as something from Dark Sun, but they are on other worlds, and they thought that they should bring this more popular insect creature as opposed to bringing the fairly obscure multiple ones from Spelljammer, which, fair enough. But then they actually did announce, they actually confirmed Spelljammer Adventures in Space, a new box set. It's coming out just next week as of recording, as I said. It's a new format for them for 5th edition. It's a slipcase with 3 smaller books, all 64 pages, I believe is what they are, as well as a DM screen and a map or 2. I know the Rocket Brawl gets a map. I think there might be another one. Maybe it's just the double-sided. But one book is called Astral Adventurer's Guide, which talks about how spelljamming works and gives you the player options. All those ones from the Unearthed Arcana have made it into the final book. There's a couple of subclasses in there as well. The second book is called Boo's Astral Menagerie, which is just a monster manual, essentially. Whole bunch of random stuff. Giant space hamsters, of course, show up as Boo, the miniature giant space hamster, aka just a hamster. But yeah, it looks like they have good greatest hits of Spelljammer creatures. There was a lot in those old monstrous compendiums. I was like, really? Like, this is what we're going with? Okay, I guess. A lot of bugs in space, apparently. They were very fond of making space bugs. And then finally, in Spelljammer Adventures in Space, they're having a adventure book called The Light of Xerixis. I like this. It's a little bit more expensive. I think it retails for $70. I think that's MSRP. But 3 different books, which having this much, especially with the Adventurer's Guide, having those player options, it's cool to hear players. You can look at this book. You don't get spoiled for the adventure. You're not going to be able to look at all these monster stats and stuff. I think functionality-wise, it seems like if you want to have all these things in one product, which of course they do because then more people will buy it. So it makes sense business-wise. But separating out so it's at least a little bit harder to, oh, now I know what's happening in the adventure. There you go. And running up to that, they put out a few other things. They actually made a new monstrous compendium for Spelljammer. You could get it for signing up for an account at a D&D website, or you could get it on D&D Beyond. It included stats for the Asteroid Spider, Clockwork Horror, Eldritch Lich, the Fractine, the Gadabout, the Goon Balloon, the Nightmare Beast, the Puppeteer Parasite, the Star Lancer, and the Yggdrasti, this segment of the world tree Yggdrasil, which is pretty cool. There's some cool stuff in there. Also for free, they've put out a series of adventures called Spelljammer Academy. And I don't want to spoil anything that happens in them, but the basic premise is that you're going to the Spelljammer Academy, which is actually on an island off the coast of Chult. It's run by Mert the Moneylender, or as he's going by now, Mert the Merciless, which is this famous character from the Forgotten Realms. It's really cool to see him in an adventure like this, but it's 4 different adventures all tied together, which is really fun. And again, you can get it for free at D&D Beyond. You need an account, but the account is free, so you could just grab those and read them. I'll put a link down below. And then also, they're currently running an actual play called Legends of the Multiverse, which is a wonderful cast of a veritable who's who of people in the streaming space. And they're going on a Spelljammer adventure. It starts off in the Rock of Brawl, and they're apparently planning on tying it into Dragonlance later this year, which is pretty fun. But yeah, until I get my hands on the new box set for 5th edition, that's everything from Spelljammer, basically. Before looking into the stuff for this episode, I was very much more a fan of Planescape than Spelljammer. But looking into all the wild and wacky stuff that has come before and the stuff that they got planned for this new one, such as vampirates, which is exactly what they sound like, vampire pirates, it seems like really just fun, a lot more fun than I expected it to be, which is very cool. And I definitely would love to play in this setting. Go out on these wild and wacky adventures using these pseudo-scientific Grubian physics to all these random worlds, known or unknown. But thank you very much for listening. This is Eldritch History. My name is Jacob Tomlinson Korst. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend so we can grow the show, keep it going. And as always, till next time, may you always make your saving throw, especially to keep your barrels of smoke powder used for your giant bombast ship from exploding due to an impact.